I was excited to have a chance to talk about this. And so I'm going to go over some of the trends in the area. And to do that, really the main tool that we have available to us is that of the Census of Agriculture. And it's timely because, as many of you are probably quite aware, the census for 2021 is now here for us both as individuals as well as farmers. So I'd encourage you on both ends to complete the census, because it is really the true physical count of production assets, land, labor, and capital when it comes to agriculture in this country. And it is really the main tool that we have for getting information down to the local level, so below the provincial level. It is the tool that helps us understand cropland, farm practices, livestock, individual businesses, that kind of thing. It's really quite important. And so I'd encourage you to do that. And it gives us the tools to be able to look at things like the Quinte watershed. And one of the things that the census is most discussed about when it comes out is the concept of total farm area. And this is a really important concept within the census and part of agriculture in general. And it's a key feature of how you would evaluate an area, particularly like a watershed. And so it's an important concept. So I want to take just a couple seconds to talk about it, and hopefully you'll find it interesting and it will help inform for future information. So this is the land that is used by farmers. It's not the land that's available to be farmed or the land that's zoned for agricultural purposes. This is the land that's being used currently by farmers. It includes both owned and rented, workable and non-workable in the case of owned, and generally just workable in the case of rented. And I'm going to come back into that a little bit. It breaks farm area into total crop area, so grains and oilseeds, fruits and vegetables, alfalfa, other types of tame hay, sod, and nursery, summer fallow, which isn't really all that common a thing in Canadian or in Ontario agriculture, but certainly in Western Canada, tame and seeded pasture, which is managed pasture, natural land for pasture. So, for example, I pasture quite a bit of cattle around Colborne. We have pasture that we manage actively, and we have some natural land that we pasture as well. And so we would have a breakdown of that, woodlands and wetlands, and then other land on the farm. And those are important features, especially in parts of central, eastern, and northern Ontario relative to maybe, say, Western Ontario, Guelph, where I live and work most of the time. And there's a few concepts there that are worth understanding, and I think it will relate to some of the land changes. And again, a year from now, we could potentially do the same presentation again when the census data comes out for 2021. And so the picture in this slide is a picture of a farm in Eastern Ontario, and it's an example of the woodlands that would be listed on that farm. The acreage below has been part of farming and part of the total farm area in that area, right down to a township. In this particular example, it's Lanark County, since 1871, but the farm family is no longer actively farming it. So on the census, the next census, which is coming up, the farm area is going to decrease to just the total cash crop areas that are now rented out on that farm. And so depending on the area, depending on how that sort of plays out in terms of land that's available, that's a big thing in terms of this concept of how total farm area changes, especially again around things like wetlands, etc. And a big one here is natural land for pasture, which I'll talk about in a second. This is also a fairly common site throughout central, eastern, and in this example, northern Ontario, where we have land clearing. And in that example, in this particular example, the acreage below here has not been part of the total farm area for about 70 years. It has not been actively farmed. It was once farmed. It's assessed for agricultural purposes, but it has not been farmed. This was a picture taken such that it wasn't in crop use for the 2016 census, but it will be in crop use for the 2021 census. And throughout parts of Eastern Ontario, there's pictures of this I could have taken on my farm where we've cleaned fence bottoms, tile drained land, that kind of thing. And so this change in land use is a big thing. And especially, again, the transition of natural land for pasture to tame and seeded pasture, tame seeded pasture and hay land into cropland is another big aspect of it. And I'm going to come back to this as we go because it's quite important. This is a graph of the total farm area in Ontario. So that's for the entire province from 1871 through to the 2016 census. The province of Ontario has done an agricultural statistics book every single year since 1871. We quit doing it in 1996, and now it's our ministry statistics site, which I lead through our ministry. And this particular information is taken from the agricultural census. The orangish lines, they represent the total farm area. That's all of the land used by farmers, cropland, pasture, hay, woodland on their farm, etc. Again, owned, non-workable, workable in the concept of the census. The blue represents the total crop area. So that's hay, horticultural crops, grains and oilseeds, and the like. And you can see the number's been fairly steady and fairly consistent. And that's one of the things I think that's important to understand about the concept of farm area, that it is evolving over time as we transition land from hay or tame and seeded pasture into cropland. And I'm going to come back to this on several occasions, but it's an important point depending on that. Could everybody mute their phone, please, just so that we don't have the feedback for people typing? Thanks. So again, the census gives us information, land, labor, and capital, as I mentioned, this type of information, total farm area, number of farms, crops, livestock, that kind of thing, down to essentially a township level in Ontario, all across Canada. And that's the only data collection in agriculture, or in the general census of the population for that matter, that exists to that level. So when you want to know things about Alderman Township, for example, the township that I grew up in and farm in, you need the agricultural census to do that. It is the only tool that's going to tell you about what goes on there. When you deal with a specific geography, such as a watershed, we have to do estimation of what we believe the geography is. And you can go online, obviously, and get information around what the quaternary area is for the Bay of Quinte watershed. And so what I've done for this purpose is try to put some context here. So the Telegraph Narrows and the Adelphus Reach gives you, according to the watershed data online, this particular area, about 181,000 acres roughly of total area, which would take up towns and so on and so forth. If you look at the watershed data and you overlay it with the townships that fall within the same watershed, you end up with about 17 or 18% of Quinte West, about 35% of Greater Napanee, a very small part of Loyalist, about 29% of Belleville, about 32% of Prince Edward County, about 1% of Stone Mills, and about 40% of Tyendinaga. And so the ministry, what we do basically, and we do this with you can go onto our stat site and see this for the Greenbelt, you can see it for the GTA, the GTHA. We're in the process of finishing up a database that would be available for every watershed in Ontario. But basically what it would do then is it would take that percentage of the data from the census for those areas and sort of add them up and roll them up into this. Now, it's not quite as exact as, say, doing the exact postal codes, et cetera, where businesses or farms lie within this, but it gets you very, very close. It's very adaptable. And effectively, we can have the full agricultural census database, which is 600 or 700 different variables deep for this particular quaternary or this watershed. And so when you look at the total farm area, the land that is actively used for farming within the Bay of Quinte, about 90,000 acres of the 81,000 acres that make up the Bay of Quinte area were actively farmed in 2016. My guess is that number is going to fall as we get into 2021. That's a long-term trend in Ontario and Canadian agriculture in terms of the overall total farm area. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that drop in farm area means that farmland is gone, as some of the examples I used, examples of where land goes from owned to rented, or land sits idle, which is pretty common, and so on. So there's also some information on our statistics site at the ministry under county profiles, which will take you into each county in Ontario over the last 10 years, and it will show you the amount of land in that area that is farmed in crops, etc. And this is by county, so you can see it for Northumberland, Hastings County, Prince Edward County as an example. And it will compare that to the land assessed for agricultural purposes by MPAC within that community. And effectively what happens is that once farmland has been used and assessed for agricultural purposes, it will continue on as such until it's changed into some other zoning. So it gives you a good flavor for where the farmland is, what's available, etc. There's about 125,000 acres in this Bay of Quinte zone that is assessed for agricultural purposes. So there's about 35,000, the difference between 90 and 125, that have been farmed recently in some sort of recent memory, but are basically sitting idle. What that land looks like, etc., depends, to a large degree on the area. So if you go down through parts of Prince Edward County, there's some idle land. If you go up through basically areas around Trenton, there's idle land. It'll depend a fair bit on the topography, but it gives you a feel for how that has changed. Taking a broader look at the Bay of Quinte area, what we will tend to do is we will look at how the land has changed, how uses change in a certain area relative to the rest of the province, or maybe relative to the county or the major areas around it. So from 2006 to 2016, the total farm area actively farmed within this area fell at almost twice the rate of the overall province. This isn't really surprising from my perspective. You have an area that has a lot of smaller non-contiguous parcels. That's the reality of Eastern and Central Ontario. You don't have 200 or 300 acre farms in one fell swoop and one acreage. They don't really exist like they do in Huron County, for example. So that kind of transition is relatively common. The data would suggest that total farm area and actively farmed within the Bay of Quinte has been, over the next couple of years and the last number of years, has followed that trend of about an 8% decline. So like I said, I would expect that with the release of the 2021 census that we see that active fall. This is a graph for this area showing three things. The orange line is the land and crops. That's, again, corn and soybeans, horticulture, hay, greenhouse under glass, nursery, that kind of thing. The gray line is total farm area, and the blue line is the number of farms. Those are all basically what I would expect. Smaller number of farms, that's the nature of agriculture. That's the nature of food processing in this country as well. We're constantly seeing consolidation, increasing scale, fewer farms producing more of the production. If you look at across Ontario, for example, in the 2016 census, about 2% of the farms produced about 45% of our total farm production. I would expect that 2% is producing 50 to 55% when we hit 2021. The real interesting thing, though, is that the land and crops is not changing a whole lot. And that goes back to that earlier slide for Ontario, all the way back to 1871. We're producing as much or more as we always have. The question is on what properties and where. The farm size within the Quinte area has followed a similar provincial trend. Relatively smaller number of very small farms, sort of a growing middle class in terms of the number, and depending on the area and the timing, an increase in the largest farms, especially with the run-up in grain prices that we saw basically in 2011 and 12, for example, and now that we're seeing with 2021, you can move between farm size categories around farm sales without really changing your acreage, right? So, for example, like, price of corn, you're booking corn, I could have booked at $6.50 recently, for example, and last year it was $5. So, those types of changes can reflect in that, and that's fairly consistent with the area. Another statistic within the census, which is a really important one, and again, I think this gets back to land use, and again, from the context of managing the resource, it's a concept of land prepared for seeding. And this is anything that is either no-till prepared or till prepared. So in my case, for example, all of our cropland is no-till, so basically it would fall within this. The land seeded in 2016 within the Bay of Quinte area rose about 18% from 2006 to just over 42,000 acres. That's a big jump. Land seeded within that area was about 74% of all of the land in the area in crops compared to 85%. So in other words, you have a higher proportion of land that is in crops but isn't actively seeded, which is really a reflection of perennial crops, horticulture, tree fruits in particular. They don't require an annual seeding, whether it's on a no-till or on a conventional till basis. And so that's important as well. And that kind of reflects sort of the front concept. If you look, again, keeping using my own farm, but I have land right to the shore of Lake Ontario, and a lot of our land was once apple orchard, as an example. So I think there's some relevance there just to use it as a comparison. No-till rose about 20% within the community to about just over 16,000 acres, which is quite important because, again, it has a lot to do with water runoff, that kind of thing. No-till acres within the Bay of Quinte area represent about 38% of the land seeded, compared to about 28% at the provincial average. So this is consistent with some of that activity. And again, I think that it's a reflection of the land, the topography, the types of farms that are there, and a key trend in the sector. And I think that's going to continue from my perspective. The land and crops. So again, grains and oilseeds, horticulture, hay, fell about 10% to just over 52,000 acres. It's one of the few regions in the province that saw land and crops fall. That's a pretty big thing. A lot of areas have seen significant increases. There's a lot of transitional land out of pasture, in particular if you go up through Bruce County as an example, or if you get into parts of central and eastern Ontario, and this area would partially be included, I guess, where you're seeing land that was idle or land that basically, farmers picking up 10 or 15 acres on their farm by clearing fence bottoms, that kind of thing. We've also seen within the region an interesting trend too, which is an increase in the number of small acres. This tends to be in horticulture. It tends to be people who are not relying on agriculture as their main source of income. And it tends to be basically a function of the area, which is small, less contiguous packages. So again, it's a lot easier to find a 40-acre parcel of farmland in eastern central Ontario than it is in Huron County, as an example. That just does not exist in Huron. Land and crops fell, but obviously there's some considerable changes. Corn and soybeans, less cereal and less crops, hay crops, and I think that's going to continue as well, and we'll come back to that. Looking at the breakdown of crops, the growth in soybean acreage far outpaced provincial levels within this area. Soybeans are, from my perspective, the easiest of all of the grains and oilseed crops to grow. Later spring planting, earlier fall harvest. There's a lot of real sort of benefits, if you will, to the simplicity and ease of soybeans. And they have a bit of a natural crop cover once pulled. So there's a lot of things that sort of play within that. Fruit acreage, as I mentioned, perennial crops, which that tends to be, has been much more stable at the provincial level. And again, I think this is a reflection of the area, its history. In general, in Ontario now, the smaller fruit acreage tends to be people, and vegetable acreage too, but more so fruit, tends to be people that are selling direct to consumer. Smaller acres, they're not selling through major packers. For example, if you're an apple producer, they're not selling into the Sobeys system or the Loblaw system. They're selling direct to consumer, and that buoys up their acreage, and I think that side of it's going to continue. Pasture is a complicated one because pasture can mean a lot of things depending on the situation. Seeded pasture that would be actively managed, which isn't all as much common as you might think, really, depending where you are in the province, fell about 27% to just over 4,900 acres within the community, and this is a lower drop than at the rest of the province. And again, I think this is a reflection of when it comes to seeded pasture. If you've been somebody actively seeding and managing pasture, you're much more committed to it than somebody that's got natural land or somebody that's maybe moving electric fence and that kind of thing and pasture in and out. It goes from hay to pasture, then to corn, for example. And that's a pretty big one. Natural land for pasture fell about 43%, and this is a significantly higher drop than at the provincial level. I think the tricky one with that is that the natural land for pasture concept, it ties a lot more with farms that are transitioning. It ties a lot more with basically land that could be used for multiple purposes, and in particular maybe for lot development, that kind of thing, and can easily transition. And that's not an uncommon thing in, say, Lanark County. We've done work with them, Prince Edward County, in the broader sense, etc. So as I mentioned, it's important to note that when farmers retire or farmers are sold to non-farmers, that pasture often sits idle and is not picked up in the census, but it's still available to be farmed. If you go through Hastings County, for example, certainly to the middle part north of around Madoc, there's all kinds of land in there that's been farmed in various degrees of quality, I guess, but still available to be farmed. In terms of livestock, there's been a pretty significant decline within the watershed of all but two categories. And that decline is far outpaced provincial levels, whether it's in the cattle numbers, etc. However, there's been fairly significant growth in sheep and chicken numbers, and those have far exceeded provincial levels, which again, on the sheep side, it's a function of grazing, it's a function of a variety of different things. It's a livestock venture that has a fair bit of attractiveness to certain people in terms of what they're trying to do as far as a farm business goes, and they can utilize land in ways that even cattle can't. On the chicken side, that can be easily a function of one or two chicken barns coming in. It's a complicated statistic as well, but it does give you a reflection of effectively the concept of livestock within the sphere of what is the Bay of Quinte is falling, and that in turn is going to have impacts as far as the watershed goes, in particular on manure and manure use. And so in terms of manure application, there's a few things. We've seen a decline in the acres, which I think makes sense in terms of solid or composted manure, whether it's incorporated into the soil or not. We've seen basically a flat to, if not increasing use of liquid manure, which again, I think is a function of near urban. It's a function of there's a lot more. I know in my own case, it's a lot easier to get commercial application of product in Northumberland County in particular, and down into Prince Edward County than it once was. So you can have access to those things as a producer in ways that, you know, maybe in terms of spreading your own manure isn't as prevalent. And again, if you're seeing fewer livestock, I'm going to suspect that trend continues. Pesticide and fertilizer application, again, this is one of the areas in Canadian agriculture that's the least truly understood, because like almost like what you and I individually eat, this is something that really happens at a farm level, and it's very difficult to measure and know exactly what any one farm does. And it's, again, very similar to food consumption that way. We talk about those things all the time. How much fertilizer, how much pesticide do we apply, how much food do we eat? But knowing those two things is a lot more complicated than it sounds, because it starts at an individual level. It doesn't start at some kind of an aggregate level. And what we've seen in this area, I don't think is different than any other area of the province. We're seeing increasing use for what the land that is farmed. There's a greater number of acres where commercial fertilizers, herbicides in particular, are applied. I think in general, the rates of use are falling. The productivity that comes from that fertilizer and pesticide use is growing, but the total acreage is increasing. And so there's a variety of other things underneath that. I'm assuming Tom's going to talk to a fair bit of this after. So to wrap up, I guess, you know, I think the thing that's driving things right now starts with commodity markets. And, you know, it just happens to be that we are seeing a run up in grain prices at a level that, you know, has been pretty rapid, is pretty almost extreme in some respects. And that's going to drive land use for the next little while. So we've got 4 price charts here. I'm happy to send this presentation around to anybody who is interested in it. This is all public information. You get all of this on our ministry stat site. Long-term corn prices are at or above the highest level since 1992, as far back as we were recording. Soybeans by far since 1998. Wheat prices, winter wheat prices in particular, one of the highest in record, although they've tended to be a little bit flatter because it's a more direct food product. Feeder steer prices, which is a more prominent industry in the area, in particular around feeding stocker cattle, have been strong, but fairly flat, certainly relative to the price spike of 2016 or so, where you could get, you know, 3 years worth of income from one steer effectively. All of those things are contributing to significant demand for agricultural land. It's driving people into certain areas. There's a lot of pressure across Ontario, obviously, from a fruit and vegetable production point of view. Demand is very strong. Anybody that's selling fruit and vegetables direct to consumer knows that the demand through COVID has really expanded, but the risks associated with production continue to grow. And relative to corn, soybeans, and wheat, which have become a much more standard thing to produce from an agronomic point of view, the profit and the returns and the sort of overall stress level of producing those things is much easier. And so the pressure on land use, I think, will continue to be more beans, more corn in the area. We've seen more winter wheat. Our winter wheat that we've got this year, for example, is phenomenal. We're 8 to 10 days early. I think even through parts of the east and where the watershed is, I know in our case, if we get off early, we're gonna be planting double crop soybeans, which is unheard of east of Toronto and certainly not very common. But people are going to try it, and there'll be a number of things that reflects, and some of the census data will show that as well. But I think those trends continue. That said, the area is unique because of the water, which brings to it, in our farm's case, most of our farm, we have a view of Lake Ontario that there's hardly as good a view anywhere on the lake. And so, the demand for land in these areas goes far beyond just the agricultural productivity or value of it. And I think that's going to continue as well in terms of land values. And in particular, people wanting to access that land. Land comes up for sale. It's not just farmers competing for it. And when that happens, this idea of total farm area really comes into play. You don't see that in Huron County. There isn't an acre of land up in Huron County that isn't going to be farmed. It doesn't matter who owns it. But in Eastern and Central Ontario, that's not necessarily the case. It may be very productive from a relative point of view. Like our yields on our farm are higher than we would have ever expected because of a variety of different things, in particular the types of varieties and the heat units that are available to us. But the reality is that pressure on total farm area is going to keep changing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the land is going to no longer be available to be farmed, but it's going to have an impact on what land is farmed. And that's going to play into a variety of different things in terms of the census data, in terms of, the amount of fertilizer that's applied, manure that's applied, livestock base, and, just the overall impact that it has on the watershed in general. But I expect that those trends will continue. I really think land and crops will probably flatten out, if not increase in the community. From my perspective, I don't think you'll see the drop that it occurred in 2016. And again, I think that the sector from a profitability point of view has a lot of positives to it, but that puts significant competition and pressure on the land. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll welcome questions later on, and I'll turn it over to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was a very interesting presentation in terms of the degree of detail on the different categories of pasture, natural and seeded, as well as the hay crops and that sort of thing. Those kind of numbers are not always that easily available. I'm going to move from the 60,000 acres of the Bay of Quinte watershed, and I'm going to discuss a bit more focused again on the nutrients, but I have to move up to the level of the whole province. So going from 60,000 acres to 10 million, according to Steve's presentation. Can someone confirm that you can see my slides here on trends in nutrient stewardship in Ontario?
We can see it, Tom.
Excellent. Okay. Well, and I'm really pleased to get the invitation to speak to you today. I've worked in the fertilizer industry for about 25 years, essentially providing science support for nutrient stewardship activities of the fertilizer industry in Canada, in the US, and worldwide. And I continue to do that through a new organization called Plant Nutrition Canada. To find out more about it, you can visit the website plantnutrition.ca. The main program we have in the industry that advances for our nutrient stewardship, is the 4 R's. The application of the right source of nutrients at the right rate, at the right time, and in the right place, within the context of other cropping system practices that produce a more sustainable result for the environment, for everyone's economic benefit, and also for social benefits. The way we often look at the impacts of the 4 R's is this list of 9 outcome areas. And to one extent or another, nutrient management affects all 9 of them. But of course, it's not the only thing controlling the impacts on all 9. The top 3, farmland productivity, essentially is crop yield, soil health. We're looking at soil fertility, nutrient use efficiency. Those are things that through management of source, rate, time, and place, you can get improvements that improve yields, improve the health of your soils, and through getting enhanced nutrient use efficiency, it also leads to higher profits. That part is excellent, but it goes beyond that. Beyond their effects on those 3, source, rate, time, and placement of nutrients can have impacts on water quality, air quality, greenhouse gases, and more. I'm going to focus today on phosphorus and water quality, presuming that in the watershed there are impacts on water quality, and often the nutrient that has the most impact is phosphorus. deal a lot with foreign nutrient stewardship and nitrogen as well, but I will have very little on that in today's presentation. I'm going to speak a little bit about experiences I've had in the past 10 years working in the watershed of Western Lake Erie, and it's still an interesting challenge. In Lake Erie, both dissolved and particulate forms of phosphorus losses are important. If you look at an early spring image from the satellites of the Western Basin, you see this brown water that's coming in from the Maumee River, draining about 4 million acres of cropland in the northwest of Ohio. And if you look in Lake St. Clair, you see the same thing coming out of the mouth of the Thames River, draining a very important and productive part of southwestern Ontario's agriculture. In the spring, we're still getting more soil loss than we really want. So controlling erosion and controlling particulate loads can be important. Later on in the year, this is a photograph in 2017, late September, you're seeing the algal bloom, and that the science has shown is more correlated to the dissolved form that's been increasing since about the year 2002 to be precise, in the Maumee River and likely in other rivers as well. That bloom there is in the Western Basin. You can see a trace of green again at this time of the year coming from the mouth of the Thames into the top of the Detroit River here. So it's something that these kind of photos are available now. You can Google Coast Watch Lake Erie and find this sort of image. And these are issues that are very much in the public eye. And the same thing, the same website will give you information on Lake Ontario. I don't know enough to interpret what I'm seeing here, but it doesn't look like I'm seeing anything of concern as of just a couple of days ago here in Lake Ontario and the Bay of Quinte watershed. But I've got some numbers here for the Western Lake Erie watershed. Again, this shows that extent of about 4 million acres of cropland. And if we look at comparison of the year 1987 to the year 2014, and look at the phosphorus outputs and inputs in the cropping there, crop removal in 2087 was 30 kilotons of phosphorus, 30,000 tons of phosphorus. The inputs in fertilizer were 37, and manure was 5, so with a phosphorus use efficiency, therefore, of 72%. We were really putting on more than we were removing. By 2014, the crop yields in that watershed had increased such that phosphorus removal was now 49 kilotons. Fertilizer had gone down to 31, and manure was remaining roughly at the same. We're basically in a phosphorus deficit situation, but over that same time period, the loss of dissolved phosphorus to the lake through the river actually doubled. And there are many studies published on it, but one of the best ones is one published by Helen Jarvie about 4 years ago. And she basically coined it as an unintended consequence of conservation tillage. Essentially, one of the trends in there was the increasing use of less tillage, more of the stover staying on the surface, less soil erosion, but at the same time, farmers continued their application techniques. And not everyone, but about 40%, 50% of the phosphorus fertilizer is going on with a broadcast application into no-till land, and so that's never being incorporated into the soil. And that is a very strong possible cause of the increase in dissolved phosphorus. It's not the total amount necessarily, but it's the way it's applied. And just to give you some arguments for that, we've always looked at fertilizer phosphorus as something that sticks to the soil. It's quite right. When it's mixed to the soil, it sticks in. But when the fertilizer is still in the granule, it has a very high solubility. 84,000 milligrams of phosphorus per liter is what monoammonium phosphate will dissolve into. In the soil, we only need 0.1 to 0.3 milligrams of phosphorus per liter. And the target for the water in the Maumee River is around 0.05, 0.047 to be precise. And the similar targets exist now for rivers in Canada. So the thing is, letting the phosphorus go directly to water, we're going to have a huge effect on these concentrations. This is shown by some data from an experiment where fertilizer was either incorporated into the soil by tillage or left on the soil surface before it.
Yeah, you can't have that.
It's okay. It's okay.
I'm doing it.
I can't.
Shut up.
Thank you. And what we're showing here is that when the fertilizer at various rates, 25, 50, 150, 200 kilograms per hectare, is applied and left on the surface, the runoff phosphorus concentration goes up quite high. If it's incorporated into the soil, there's very little effect on the concentration of phosphorus in the runoff water. So we can do a lot with the right place practice of ensuring the phosphorus is placed below the surface of the soil or incorporated into the soil. We can also manage it by with time. If what I showed you in the previous slide was what happens if the rain induces runoff from the soil immediately within an hour of applying the fertilizer. If we wait several days, already the effect is diminished. If the first rain that falls after a surface application of phosphorus just doesn't generate runoff, it puts most of the fertilizer into the soil. I should emphasize as well that in these kind of events, it's only a very small fraction of the applied phosphorus that is actually lost and causes the water quality impact. The actual effect on the crop is pretty minor. You'd never notice it because less than 10% of the fertilizer is lost, even in the worst storm. And a lot of the management can be assessed using tools like Plato that comes from OMAFRA. They take into account erosion, water runoff, soil test phosphorus, fertilizer rate and method, being timing and placement, and the same thing for manure rate. And so this tool at agrisuite.omafra.gov is a handy tool for farmers to use for ensuring that their management does not have adverse effects on water quality. Now, having said all that, we do want to focus somewhat on the status of phosphorus in the soils and other nutrients as well. So I'm going to highlight a data product that we've been working on for the last little while. This is we call it the Soil Test Summary, and it's across North America. We've just completed the 2020 results. It looks at the levels of soil test phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, zinc, chloride, soil organic matter, and pH. We've done this survey fairly systematically since about 2001 across North America at the scale of the entire states and province. So for each state and each province, we have a distribution then of soil test levels within them. This is now housed by the Fertilizer Institute. This survey was developed and originally done by the International Plant Nutrition Institute. The story it has for Ontario, if we look at 2001 to 2020, is that soil test phosphorus in Ontario has declined since 2001. In 2001, we had over 50% of the soils were testing at an Olsen level above 38 parts per million. That's not any particularly special level, although it's generally higher than most crops need. Most agronomists may recommend that the soil tests be maintained somewhere between 20 and 30 parts per million. That's already fairly generous. You can grow crops below that, provided the crop is fertilized every year. But what we are seeing is that even in some of the very low categories here, categories of only 4 to 7 parts per million, we're seeing an increasing fraction of Ontario's soils fall into that category. And the same thing is true for soils in the range 8 to 11 parts per million. such that below this 20 part per million critical level, we now have, instead of 25% of our soils, fully 1/3 of the soils of Ontario test below 20, generally needing a phosphorus application with every crop to ensure that the crop is not phosphorus limited. The amount of soils falling into the agronomic recommended range is about staying the same. We are seeing a reduction in that very large number of soils testing higher than we ought to, down to about 38%. And you may ask, where did all that phosphorus come from? Well, if we look at the history of phosphorus use in Ontario, I showed you a phosphorus balance in numbers for the Western Lake Erie watershed. Ontario has a similar story. If we look at by 1950, we were fertilizing our crops with as much as they removed, and then we started to fertilize them even more because we were trying to build up soils that were deficient in phosphorus. And over the years, fertilizer plus manure applied to land relative to the amount taken out by the green dots here, the crop removal, there was a surplus. We went back down again by the 1990s, owing partly to economics, partly to management concerns, managing for better efficiency, to a point where we actually had deficits in the cropland balance for a number of years. But now we're back to a level where fertilizer and manure is basically replacing what crops are removing. But in that past history, we had 14 years worth of surplus. 14 years of crop removal is represented by the area of that surplus phosphorus applied in those years. That amounts to about 500 pounds per acre on average across Ontario. But the thing is, it wasn't distributed uniformly either. Some soils testing high, others not so much. And so that the question about where those high testing soils come from, this figure explains quite a bit of it. As Steve noted, yields have been increasing, fertilizer rates declining, and crop removal of phosphorus is increasing in proportion with those yields. So it is something to be continually paying attention as to whether we're applying the right rate. We have information on soil test potassium as well. Soil test potassium in the last summary in 2015 had gone up from 5 years previous. This time, the levels had gone down. The frequency of soils testing low in potassium was increasing. That appears to have changed in this latest iteration of the soil test survey. The potassium in Ontario soils is distributed a little differently than the phosphorus in that they're centered around what we consider a critical level of around 120 part per million. For the first time, we did soil organic matter in the soil test summary, and so we have data only for 2020. From 100,000 samples in Ontario, we've got a median of about 3.3% and a fairly wide distribution. So quite a few soils testing considerably less, quite a few soils testing considerably more. Other provinces in Canada tend to have higher soil organic matter levels than Ontario. But we're fairly consistent with surrounding states, and perhaps even a little better than states like Michigan and Wisconsin. The industry is also surveying the 4R practices that are done, and this becomes very complicated when you're looking at a number of nutrients, 4 nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and trying to evaluate the source, the rate, the time, and the place for each of the different key crops in Ontario, Western Canada, and then it's done over a number of years as well. There are hundreds of slides of results from this survey. I'm just going to give you a real snippet here, looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur for corn in Ontario for the year 2020. And the main focus here again is phosphorus. We're looking at, how much of our phosphorus is broadcast on the surface with no incorporation compared to broadcast followed by incorporation or applied in the spring and with incorporation. You see the amounts applied with no incorporation are fairly small. We've got 5.8% there, 1.7%, and another 4.3%. We're roughly on the 10 to 15%, but we would really like to see that get smaller as well, where it's a risk to water quality, particularly on poorly drained soils that are likely to generate runoff. That is a practice that we should be paying attention to in watersheds where where algal blooms are an issue. Along with the attention to 4Rs, there have been programs that have been developed that give third-party verification to ensure that practice standards are being met for source, rate, time, and place. There's a program in Ohio. There's a program now in Ontario as well, focused a lot on Lake Erie, but there's no reason why it can't be applied to Lake Ontario as well. It's an approach that has growing interest. There is a certification program in New York. There's interest in Indiana and Minnesota, Missouri, and Florida, and broad outreach programs in some of the other states as well as the rest of Canada, where in place of a certification program, the ag retailers are going for a nutrient stewardship designation program. So just to sum up my comments, the soil test, the nutrient balance, and for our practice surveys, they help inform crop nutrient management. Phosphorus losses to water can be reduced through source, rate, timing, and placement of applied nutrients. And we invite your collaboration in the continuing evolution of 4R. If you want any further information, including the slides from this presentation, you can find them at the Plant Nutrition Canada website, plantnutrition.ca. So thanks very kindly for your attention.
Thank you, Tom. That was very interesting. Now we'll pass it over to Jason, who will discuss the Bay of Quinte Remedial Action Plan's stewardship opportunities. As well, I'd like to remind anybody, if you have any questions, please enter in the chat. It's right at the top, should be right at the top of your screen, the little bubble with the 2 lines in it, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentations. Thank you. All yours, Jason.
I just wanted to let you know that for the chat thing, it won't let me actually send anything in the chat. I don't know if anybody else is having the same problem as well, but I went to type in a question and then the send button is grayed out. So I don't know if it's locked or something like that. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, well, if that's the case, we can, I guess, field questions another way at the end of the presentation. So thank you for letting us know. Yeah, so I'm going to talk very briefly, 5 to 10 minutes, just about some of the stewardship programs that we have available through the Bay of Quinte Remedial Action Plan. Some of you missed this portion at the beginning, and some of you it'll be a little bit of a refresher, but the Bay of Quinte Remedial Action Plan began in the 80s when the Bay of Quinte was identified as an area of concern. So what it does primarily is help clean up the Bay of Quinte and addressing various concerns dealing with nutrients primarily. It is directed by the Bay of Quinte Restoration Council, and the council includes members from local conservation authorities, federal and provincial agencies, and non-government organizations. It is chaired by Lower Trent Conservation and Quinte Conservation. And right now, the main focus is to keep phosphorus out of the Bay of Quinte. This is the area in which we work. So it is the Lower Bay of Quinte watershed. So the programs I'm going to be discussing are available within this watershed here. So the first program, which dovetails nicely off of the last presentation, is the Healthy Soils program, where we provide free soil sampling for up to 100 acres per landowner. And what happens there is I come on the property, I take soil samples and send those off to analysis. at an OMAFRA accredited laboratory, and then I provide you with the results on a simple contour map. These are the things that we test for. So macronutrients like phosphorus, micronutrients, pH, organic matter level. So all these things that can help you manage your fertilizer application or the kinds of crops that you're growing. The cover crop program is another one that we offer. This is a rebate of $10 per acre up to 100 acres or $1,000, where you get in contact with me and you let me know that you're going to be using cover crops and you apply to this program, and then we provide that rebate after they're planted. This is across the entire watershed area that I showed you, but there are priority areas within the lower Napanee watershed as well as the Hay Bay area. Waterway planting. So this is a program where we provide a rebate of up to $1,000 or 100% of the project for people who want to create permanent buffer zones across waterways and wetlands. So if you wanted to plant native vegetation around a stream on your property or wetland, this is to help fund that. It does have to be native plants, and we do ask for a minimum of a 5-meter buffer from the shoreline whenever you're planting. Livestock fencing. This is one where we provide up to 70% of a project, up to $7,500 to help put up fencing to restrict livestock from accessing a waterway or wetland on your property. So this can cover things like fencing materials, permits, contractor installation fees, whatever's really necessary to keep your livestock out of waterways. And this one often goes with the last program, the alternate watering system program. So if you're keeping livestock out of a waterway, you're probably going to want a new way to provide water to that livestock. So again, 70% of a project up to $7,500. This is only available if the livestock is fenced out of the waterway, but this can cover all sorts of different types of watering systems. Like you see here, gravity fed, wind, solar, and even potentially drilling of a new well if that well is used solely by the livestock, so not any of the people on the land. And the last one is kind of a catch-all that can cover up to 50% of a project up to $7,500. Essentially just a number of projects that contribute to reducing erosion on the property and or improving the water quality in the Bay of Quinte and its tributaries. So this can cover things like manure storage improvements, erosion control structures, barnyard runoff control, stormwater management, constructing wetlands, all sorts of different programs. So again, if you are interested in any of those sound appealing to you, or some neighbors or landowners that you know, and you are in this area, please get in contact with me and we can talk about your project, talk about getting an application in, and hopefully we can help keep the Bay of Quinte clean and help you keep your nutrients and your land and your soil on your property, which is what everybody wants. I just wanted to say really quickly that we are sending out a survey for the participants. It's only 10 questions. It's mostly multiple choice, and you can complete it in about 3 minutes. And this is very valuable for us because it lets us know, for example, what time of day and what time of year is really good for you to have these sorts of webinars. What kind of other subjects are you looking for? What you thought of the speakers or the topics. So it really helps us improve future workshops and webinars. And just one note, this is going out via Eventbrite, and often when the Eventbrite emails go out automatically, they end up in people's junk mail. So after this workshop, or after this webinar, sorry, you should have this survey in your inbox, and if you don't, please check the junk mail folder. And that's the last thing that I wanted to say. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go to a little question period here, but I wanted to leave all of our contact information up. Sarah, who spoke at the beginning, you can reach her at smidlandjones@bqrep.ca. There's my email there, Steve's and Tom's as well. So I don't know if Anne or Sarah wants to come on and field some questions for Steve and Tom.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, since we seem to be having an issue with our chat, if anybody has some questions, please unmute yourself and we will attempt to get an answer for you.
All right, I'll jump in. I do have one question. It was about what Steve had talked about in the beginning when he was saying about in Hastings County, there's, I forget the exact number, so I apologize, but 120,000 acres available and there's only 85,000 being farmed. Do you say that like from OMAFRA's perspective, is that a negative, or do you say that from a positive or like a neutral stance? Like, is that something OMAFRA wants to see changed, or is that decline you're talking about in those acres being farmed kind of a positive thing for the watershed itself, or do you guys want to see farmers grabbing those up and trying to make them work?
Yeah, so the information that I was referring to was that in the Quinte watershed, we are estimating around 90,000 acres actively farmed, and there's about 125,000 acres in that same, again, Quinte watershed that is assessed for ag. So the difference, 35,000, effectively is sitting idle in one way, shape, or form. Some of it's farmable, some of it's not. It depends a little bit on where you are. I think that from a ministry point of view, our objective is that we want to make sure that, number one, we're protecting farmland, the ag zoning, that kind of stuff is there. That's number one. Number two, that if land is assessed for agriculture and available to be farmed, we want to see it farmed if possible. We want to make sure that the incentives are there to do that, relative to the other things that are at play. And the reason that I point this out is that the farm area number, which is always declining, is often used as a reference to say we're losing farmland. And that is true at some level, but there is a lot of land sitting idle out there, right? And so the question then becomes what's the best use of it? How do we use it? And what are some of the things that affect it? So I don't know that we have a specific objective per se. The land is individually owned, so it's really up to individuals how they want to best use it. But our objective is to continually try to grow the sector and move the base. So those idle acres, especially in areas, that's why I point out the small non-contiguous parcels, they have they're attractive to certain groups of people from an agricultural point of view. People that want to farm smaller scale, people who want to maybe pasture smaller ruminants, people that maybe want to do small fruit and vegetable production, that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, that makes total sense. I appreciate that. And I can see that in the area where we are around Brighton, that it's a lot of smaller areas, down in the southwest London type.
Exactly.
area.
Exactly. Yeah,
and
for
then
sure.
I guess OMAFRA would, like you said, have those incentives in place to help people who want to turn that into active farmland to help them get that.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Like to be honest with you, the days of grants and those types of things that existed, I'm 49, that kind of stuff existed when I was growing up. It doesn't really, to be honest with you, exist as much anymore. I think that some of the things that were talked about around here around fencing and that kind of stuff are good tools to help people manage the land well, right? So I pasture a lot of cattle, and you fence off your waterways and you fence off your water sources, and that's good for the water. It's also good for your livestock, right? Cattle drinking dirty water don't gain like the ones drinking clean water, right? So there's a lot of benefits to it that have evolved over time. The incentive side of it, I think, again, depends mostly on individuals, right? I think if you look at that area, there's a lot of people who are either, from the area and are trying to move into a little bit more of a rural setting with a bit of space and can see agriculture as something that complements their other income, whatever that may be. Or there's people that are moving into the community, which is, COVID's probably increased that a fair bit in that regard. Hopefully they see the incentives to produce agriculture in ways that, that will keep the land active. But the key to me is that it's there, that it's not paved over. And that's really what this impact data shows. It's zoned for ag. It could be used for ag. It's a question of how do we go about that?
Okay, awesome. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Are there any more questions? Well, if there's no more questions, then I would like to thank our presenters very much. Excellent job from everybody. Lots of really interesting information. And as Jason put up, there's everybody's contact. And so if you do have any questions you think of, you have everybody's emails. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.